So we'll start with Joanne. You have the full bios in the packet. We're going to start with Joanne for the first 10 or 15 minutes. Is that all right?
No, I think we have much longer now that Benjamin Barber isn't here.
Okay. Well, so this is what we wanted, was that spark and enthusiasm. Okay. Well, let's see how this goes, and I'm going to look to you, Leo, if I need to rein in our panelists.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. Thanks to the Schenker Institute for inviting me. And I suppose, and thanks for your interesting introduction. And I suppose I should say right away that if you want to begin to think about education and private foundations, a good place to begin is with Rick Hess's essay in his volume of collected essays, With the Best of Intentions. On that, we agree quite a bit. So I'm going to begin just with a comment about the history. Large private foundations, what I'm going to call big philanthropy, began at the beginning of the 20th century with the founding of the Russell Sage, Rockefeller, and Carnegie foundations. And immediately, they created controversy and a lot of opposition throughout the political spectrum, from left to right. And the reason for that is that they were established really as large, immense, private corporations that would be tax exempt, dealing in good, but they themselves, the corporations, got to define what good is. They would intervene in public life, and I'm referring specifically to the orientation of these large foundations to try to solve large social problems like poverty or literacy. And they would intervene in public life, but with no accountability to the public at all. So they were seen by critics as centers of plutocratic power, threatening democratic governance. Now, it's important to say right away that these private foundations, of course, are privately governed, but they are publicly subsidized. They're publicly subsidized because they're tax exempt. And that means that every year, 35% or more of their income, depending on what the tax code says, is kept away from the public coffers. It's not given to taxes, and it's not under the control of democratically elected officials. So essentially, the public subsidizes private foundations, but the private foundations get to do whatever they want. On the question of accountability, I think it's important to think of it this way when I say they are not accountable. When a foundation project fails, for example, if privately operated charter schools displace and then underperform traditional public schools, who suffers? The students suffer, and the public at large. What about the foundation? The foundation walks away and starts another project. Now, in the 20th century, because of public distrust, and also because of occasional congressional investigations, the private foundations were cautious about advocating public policies very, very openly. They were cautious about it. They were discreet about their government ties, and they were shy of politics. So that they really kept a lower profile relative to what some of the foundations do now. And the big notorious exception, Rick already pointed out, which is the situation of the Ford Foundation getting involved with the community control of schools in New York in 1968. Now, 21st century. So we have a new crop of even larger foundations. A lot of the wealth was generated quickly, oftentimes in high-tech industry, finance, or the expanding global market. What is characteristic of a number of these foundations is that they are closely overseen by living donors, that they really function not only as private foundations, but really as personal foundations. And just to give you a sense of the size and the increase, for a long time, Rockefeller was one of the wealthiest foundations and largest. It's now 15th. The Carnegie Corporation is just 20th. There are now 67 private foundations in the United States, grant-making foundations with assets of over $1 billion. So this is a completely new and different situation. The 21st century foundations, or let me go back and say the personal foundations, let's call them that, have a very different style from the old foundations. They're programmatically very aggressive, they're publicity seeking, and they push against the limits of political activity. It's illegal for private foundations to get involved in political activity, but there are so many. Is this better or worse? Better? Sorry. Okay, you've missed everything I've said so far. Okay. Where was I? Okay. There's so many loopholes in the tax code, especially about the relationship between nonprofit organizations, between foundations and other nonprofit organizations, that it's very easy for the private foundations, if they want, to exercise a lot of political influence by funding nonprofits that then fund other organizations that can do political work. So they look at grant giving very much just like investing. It's not a question of giving away money. It's a question of investing in projects that they like or that they design themselves. And what they want is the largest return on their investment as quickly as possible. Now, this particular group, many of them in this category of personal foundations, they decided that it was their job to remake public education in the United States, and particularly public education for low-income and minority kids in urban areas. In order to really give their argument force for these reforms, they declared that public education in the United States is in such terrible shape that it is now a national security issue. I and many other people would disagree with that. It's not only that the vast majority of American parents think that their kids go to good public schools. It's that we all know that schools, public schools for middle class and upper middle class kids are really terrific. They're among the best in the world. So who am I talking about? The three foundations that are the most involved in this are the Gates Foundation, the Eli and Edith Broad Foundation, and the Walton Family Foundation. Walton Family Foundation. But there are others. There are other large foundations that are extremely involved on a national level, so that when you look at who's funding a lot of these projects, you see the same names coming up again and again in addition to the big three. So I'll just list their names. Arnold Foundation, Anschutz, Annie E. Casey, Dell, Hewlett, Joyce. There are others, but those are big ones. There are also foundations, very large foundations, funded by billionaires, so that they're personal foundations, once again, very involved in education reform, but that usually operate on a state level. One example is in Connecticut. A hedge funder, whose name is Stephen Mandel, has two of his own foundations, and he's very involved in education reform, but mostly in Connecticut. So, the reforms. Once again, I'm going to list these, but I'm sure that most of you are really familiar with them. The basic model is to make school districts and schools function like private businesses, that they should be efficient, they should be based on data, which is test scores, and that people should be fired very easily if they don't raise test scores, that kind of thing. It's very much a business model. So the reforms involve a tremendous amount of standardized testing, using the test scores to rate teachers, principals, and schools, closing down a lot of neighborhood schools, installing privately managed and sometimes for-profit charter schools, vouchers. Vouchers allow each student to take his or her state funding in the form of a voucher to a private school, including religious schools, and online instruction, the Common Core standards, and all of the massive testing that goes with the Common Core standards, and things like merit pay. These reforms are controversial. They have been from the beginning. I myself think that they've engendered more failure than success. But I'm not going to talk about the content of the reforms at all, because I really want to focus on this question of private foundations and democracy. So the way that the private foundations operate with school districts and with states in general is to offer large grants, sometimes tens of millions of dollars, sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars, for the districts or the state to undertake the pet policies of the foundations and to run very large-scale programs. And school districts across the entire country, but especially urban school districts and states in general, are resource-starved, and it's very difficult for them to say no to this money. Sometimes it's even a public relations question when the press announces that the Broad Foundation has offered $450 million to the state of New Jersey, and there's opposition to taking this money because citizens in New Jersey don't like the policies that are required. Then the school districts and the state are under pressure to say yes. You know, you say you need more resources, why won't you take this money? So it exerts a lot of pressure. And the other way, a main way that the private foundations are involved are once again through politics, which I mentioned before, and we can discuss this more because it's a little complicated about how they do it. But the goals are to elect as many state legislators and individual members of school boards, even at the local level, who support this ed reform agenda. And once you have a majority on a school board or you have a majority in a state legislature, you push through these reforms as laws, and then they're ensconced in the system. Now, the third thing that these private foundations do, which was absolutely not done by, let's call them the old-fashioned foundations, is advocacy. And by that I mean really selling their ed reform policies, selling them to government at all levels, selling them to the media, and selling them to the public. Here's one example. When the Gates Foundation began, it spent very, very little on advocacy. Today, it spends 20% of its immense budget just on advocacy, just on selling these policies. And this involves also funding all sorts of media, including publications, PBS, getting involved with like NBC for Education Nation. There's a lot of funding of the media. And this makes the press, which as far as I'm concerned, has always been half asleep as far as what's going on with education reform. It puts them under a lot of, it puts them in a compromised position in order of reporting objectively or critically about education reform. And this is one way that democracy is weakened, because in fact the press is less able to do its job. So these large personal private foundations have really defined the national debate on education reform. And from the very beginning, they defined teachers and teachers' unions as the cause of the failure, and is the enemy of change. And these ed reformers are pretty hard line. If you don't agree with what they say, you are an enemy, and you are part of the tradition that is undermining children in the United States and risking national security. Now I just want to talk a bit about how these foundations function in relationship to their grantees, in relationship to whoever gets their grants. And this, once again, is a big departure from the way things used to be done. It used to be that a large foundation would give a grant to independent researchers to do research on a particular problem and would remain steps away from that research. Or they would find existing projects that were successful and needed help and give grants to those. That doesn't work that way anymore with these personal foundations. The foundations now come to education reform with preconceived notions, which are all wrapped up in these concepts of running schools like businesses. And they tend to find researchers who will do research that they think will come out with the results they want. And the researchers want the grants, and the researchers, once again, are under a lot of pressure to find what the foundations are looking for. Then the foundations tend to design the projects themselves and then find nonprofit organizations or create nonprofit organizations to implement the programs. Then they find think tanks and people at think tanks who are friendly to their ideas to promote the projects. Then when it comes time to evaluate the projects, they fund the researchers who are going to do the evaluation. So it's very much a kind of closed system, and that prevents a lot of critical thinking from going on within the system, which is terrible in terms of the kind of work that foundations should be doing. So what you have now is a situation where grantees serve the funders. And this, when you think about it, is completely the opposite of the idea of philanthropy, which is giving back to a society, giving grants to people to do their own work. And this, too, it undermines the autonomy and the creativity of the nonprofit sector in the United States, and this weakens American democracy. And the next point that I want to make is taken almost directly from Rick Hess, or at least the formulation is, which is that these philanthropists are treated like royalty. Now, in all philanthropy, I think from the very beginning, sycophancy is built into the structure. The people who want the money, the grantees, are perpetual supplicants for the money. And it's very hard for them to give critical feedback to philanthropists. And that breeds hubris. And it's just particularly aggravated with this new generation of personal foundation runners. I would say that hubris is the core characteristic of this new mega philanthropy. Now, in the time that's left to me, which I really don't know how much it is.
2 more minutes.
Oh, okay. So I really wanted to give you specific examples of all of this, and I have a whole list of specific examples. I'm going to try to run through 2 of them really, really quickly before they start kicking me. The first is the parent trigger laws. These are, I'm going to start with California because that's where it began, and that's the law that's been used the most so far, and the law that I know the best. The way it works is, if 50%, just 50%, according to the law, of the parents of current students in a school or students who will be going to that school the following year, if just 50% of them sign a petition, that 50% of the parents can decide to close down the school, turn it over to private management for a charter school, fire the principal, or fire the principal and the entire staff. Now, the organization that has been behind this from the beginning is called Parents Revolution. It's based in California, but it operates nationally now. All of their funding, as of last fall, $14.8 million, came from foundations, including Walton, Gates, Arnold, Wasserman, Broad, and Emerson. What I want to emphasize immediately about this is that it is an anti-democratic law. The parents who have their kids in school today, in a public school today, don't have the right to change the nature of that school. It would be very much like the people who happen to be sitting in a park on a Saturday afternoon and sign a petition. If 50% of them sign a petition, they can decide to pave over the park. It's exactly the same thing. And it is the foundations that are behind this. And they declare that it's grassroots democracy because the parents get to decide what to do with the school. But it's a very warped way of thinking about democracy. The second example that I want to run through is an expose of the New York State Regents Research Fund. This was instituted in 2010, but it really wasn't discovered until an expose last November by the Albany Times Union. It turns out that the Board of Regents, which is like the Board of Education for the state of New York, they decided that they wanted to have their own ed reform think tank. And they solicited donations from private foundations. And I think they've gotten $19 million so far. And the foundations that contributed are Gates, Tisch, Hemsley, Robbins, Silicox, GE, Ford, Carnegie, the Tiger Foundation, Robin Hood, and Hewlett. This is not a small operation. This is 27 full-time people in this think tank. And the director does fundraising. They are well paid. The highest salary is $193,000. And what do? They design ed reforms, especially around teacher evaluations, that are then passed to the New York Department of Education, New York State Department of Education. And what's not at all surprising, but should be shocking, is that these employees they're called Regents researchers, they are not bound by New York's public officers law or by the ethic rules for government officials. And the chair of the Education Committee in the Assembly of New York State, when she was asked about this think tank, she had to say, "I know nothing about it." So a lot of people think that they're running an end run around the State Department of Education. And now I'm going to stop saying just this. If you want to think about this ed reform as a whole, think of any of the hearings that take place in neighborhoods when a school is going to be closed or turned into a charter, and you have hundreds of parents who show up, oftentimes low income and minority parents. They are horrified, they are angry, they scream and yell, they do not want the school closed, they don't want a charter school moved into the building, they don't want it turned over to a private management company. And these are the people who from the beginning, the mega foundations have said, we're going to help you, we're going to solve this problem for you.
Thank you so much, Joanne. That was terrific.